The night sky stretched endless and dark over the barren wasteland, a tapestry of stars glittering like distant promises. Beneath that silent expanse, the ground was cracked and lifeless, the air sharp with a metallic scent of dust. He trudged through it, boots crunching on brittle stone, a lone figure in the desolate expanse. His name didn't matter out here, and neither did his past. He was simply a wanderer, seeking purpose in a galaxy that no longer seemed to care. It was the faintest sound that stopped him, a whisper of pain carried on the wind. He turned his head, eyes narrowing as he scanned the horizon. It could have been the wind, the creak of distant rocks, but something in the sound tugged at him. He followed it, his steps quickening, until he came upon a hollow hidden by jagged cliffs. There, crumpled like a broken-winged bird, was something, or someone. She lay motionless, her skin an otherworldly shade of silver, hair like flowing strands of twilight. Her breathing was shallow, each rise and fall of her chest labored, as if each breath might be her last. He knelt beside her, hesitating only a moment before placing a hand on her shoulder. Her skin was cold, far too cold. She opened her eyes, slitted pupils focusing on him with a desperate, pleading gaze. Her lips moved, but the words were lost to him. He didn't need to understand her language to grasp the meaning. She was dying. Frantically, he checked for injuries. A deep gash ran across her side, the edges of the wound blackened with something that looked like poison. Blood, if it could be called that, trickled from the wound, glowing faintly in the dim light. His heart raced. He had no medkit, no tools that could help. He was only human, a fragile being on an unforgiving world. She grasped his hand, her fingers trembling. There was a silent plea in her eyes, a spark of something primal and raw. He didn't know why, but he felt it too. Without fully understanding what he was doing, he pulled a knife from his belt, the blade reflecting the starlight. His hand shook as he made a shallow cut across his palm, the pain sharp but fleeting. Blood welled up, warm and red, and he pressed it to her wound. At first, nothing happened, and he feared the act had been in vain. But then, the glow from her wound brightened, pulsing like the rhythm of a heartbeat. She gasped, her body arching as the glow spread, veins lighting up beneath her skin. He watched, transfixed, as her breathing steadied, her color returning. She was healing, because of him. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft, melodic, and filled with gratitude he couldn't quite comprehend. "You saved me." He smiled, though exhaustion tugged at him now. "Yeah, I guess I did." But he had no idea what that act would mean, for either of them. The night grew colder as they sat beneath the alien stars, the two of them bound by a thread of fate neither could yet understand. They sat in silence for a time, the only sound the faint whisper of the wind over the jagged rocks. She shifted slightly, her silver skin catching the starlight in a way that made her seem ethereal, like a figure carved from moonlight itself. Her hand rested on her side where the wound had once been, now fully closed, though faint scars remained like delicate silver threads. "You risked much," she said at last, her voice stronger but still carrying a lilting accent. "Why?" He shrugged, unsure how to explain the impulse. "Seemed like the right thing to do. Couldn't just leave you there to die." Her eyes, sharp and feline, regarded him with something that resembled both curiosity and confusion. "You are human. Most of your kind would not. Most of my kind don't wander alone across dead planets either." He gave her a half-smile, though the weight of her words lingered. "Who are you?" She hesitated, as if weighing how much to reveal. "My name is Elyra," she said finally. Was a scout." Her gaze darted to the horizon, wary, as if expecting shadows to emerge from the darkness. "My ship crashed here." He frowned. "Was someone chasing you?" Her expression darkened, and she drew her knees to her chest. "Yes. My people are hunted." A chill ran through him, and he glanced around the barren landscape. "By who?" For a long moment, she didn't answer, and when she finally did, her voice was barely above a whisper. "The Dominion. They enslave or destroy those they deem inferior." His stomach twisted. The Dominion. He'd heard whispers of them, an empire that expanded ruthlessly, crushing entire species beneath their heel. "You're running from them?" "I was," Elyra said, her voice bitter. "But now Now I am alone. She looked at him, her eyes softening. Until you. The weight of her words settled between them, heavy and unspoken. He didn't know why he'd felt the need to help her, but now that he had, he was part of something far larger than he'd ever intended. You're not alone anymore, he said quietly. We'll figure this out together. She studied him for a long moment before nodding. Together, then. Dawn crept over the horizon, bathing the wasteland in pale light. They moved carefully, Elyra still weak from her ordeal but determined not to slow them down. He offered his arm for support, and though she hesitated, pride flickering in her eyes, she eventually accepted. What now? He asked, breaking the silence. Elyra glanced up at the sky, her expression distant. I need to reach my people. If any of them survived. Her voice faltered, and she took a steadying breath. There's a chance they might still be out there. Do you know where they are? No, she admitted, a trace of frustration in her tone. But there's an outpost on the far side of this wasteland. If we can reach it, I can send a signal. He nodded. Then we'll go there. They walked for hours, the landscape stretching endlessly before them. The sun hung high now, its heat oppressive, and they stopped occasionally to rest in the shadows of jagged rocks. Despite the growing weariness, he noticed Elyra's strength returning. The silver glow of her veins had dimmed, but it remained just beneath the surface, a quiet reminder of the bond they now shared. You never told me your name, she said suddenly, breaking the silence. He blinked, realizing she was right. I didn't, did I? He paused, then smiled. It's Kael. Kael, she repeated, testing the name on her tongue. It suits you. He chuckled. And what's that supposed to mean? Her lips curved into the barest hint of a smile. It means I'm grateful. They pressed on, neither speaking for a time, until finally, the broken horizon shifted, revealing a structure in the distance. Kael squinted against the sunlight, hope sparking in his chest. Is that the outpost? Elyra followed his gaze and nodded. Yes. We're close now. But the sense of relief was short-lived. As they drew nearer, the distant hum of engines filled the air, a sound Kael recognized too well. His heart clenched. They found us, Elyra said, her voice cold and steady. The Dominion. Kael gritted his teeth, gripping the hilt of his knife. Then we'll fight. Elyra turned to him, her eyes fierce. You've already risked too much for me. He shook his head, stepping in front of her. I'm not letting you face them alone. The engines grew louder, and shadows stretched across the ground. Kael felt his blood pounding in his veins, but this time, he didn't feel fear. He felt something stronger, a bond forged in blood and unspoken promises. Together, Elyra said, her voice steady and unwavering. Together, Kael echoed, as the first of the Dominion ships descended from the sky. The Dominion ship touched down with a mechanical hiss, its sleek, obsidian hull gleaming under the harsh sunlight. The ramp lowered slowly, and Kael counted at least half a dozen figures emerging. They were tall, clad in dark armor that seemed to drink in the light, their movements precise and deliberate. Each carried a weapon, sleek rifles with glowing barrels that hummed ominously. Elyra stood beside him, her body tense, fists clenched at her sides. Though the wound on her side had healed, she was far from her full strength. Kael's heart raced as he assessed the situation. There were too many. They were outgunned, outmatched, and with nothing more than a knife and sheer determination, it wasn't looking good. The lead figure stepped forward, removing its helmet to reveal a pale, angular face with ridges running across its brow. Its eyes, a cold, iridescent blue, settled on Elyra with a predatory gleam. "Run away," the Dominion soldier said, its voice smooth and mocking. "You've led us on quite the chase." Elyra didn't flinch. "I will not go with you." The soldier smirked. "You misunderstand. We're not taking you back. You've outlived your usefulness." His gaze shifted to Kael. "And you, a human, giving your blood to save one of our prey? How quaint. Pity you'll die for nothing." Kael felt a surge of anger, gripping the knife tighter. "Try me." The Dominion soldier raised a hand, and the others leveled their weapons. Kael's instincts screamed at him to run, but his feet remained planted. He wouldn't abandon her. Not now. Suddenly, Elyra stepped forward, her hand raised, palm outstretched. A faint shimmer rippled in the air around her, and Kael felt the ground vibrate beneath his feet. "You forget," Elyra said, her voice like steel. "I am more than prey." With a sudden, blinding flash, a pulse of silver light erupted from her, knocking the soldiers back like ragdolls. The blast left Kael staggering, shielding his eyes from the brilliance. When the light faded, he saw the Dominion soldiers sprawled on the ground, their armor cracked, weapons scattered. Elyra swayed, the effort clearly taking its toll, but she remained standing. One of the soldiers struggled to rise, coughing, but Kael didn't give him the chance. He rushed forward, driving the knife into the soldier's side, a primal roar tearing from his throat. As the soldier collapsed, Elyra gripped Kael's arm, her breath ragged. "More will come," she whispered. "We must move." Kael nodded, wiping the blood from his knife. "Can you walk?" She straightened, determination hardening her features. "Yes." They ran, the outpost now in sight, their only hope for survival. Behind them, the Dominion ship lay in ruin, but Kael knew it wouldn't be the end. The Dominion didn't give up so easily. They reached the outpost's gates, the structure old and weathered, its surface pockmarked with age. Kael hammered on the metal door, shouting until it groaned open. An old, haggard man peered out, eyes widening at the sight of them. "Please," Kael said, desperation lacing his voice. "We need help." The man hesitated but then stepped aside, motioning them in. "Hurry." They stumbled inside, the heavy door slamming shut behind them. Elyra sank to the floor, her breathing labored, while Kael stood guard, knife still in hand. "Who are you running from?" the old man asked, his voice wary. "The Dominion," Kael answered, glancing at Elyra. The man's face paled. "Then you've brought death to my doorstep." Kael's jaw tightened. "We didn't have a choice." The old man sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. "No one ever does." He looked at Elyra, his expression softening. "You're one of the Zhelari, aren't you?" Elyra nodded weakly. "Yes." The man nodded grimly. "Then I'll help you. But you'll need more than my shelter to survive what's coming." Kael glanced at Elyra, then back at the man. "What do we need?" The old man's eyes gleamed with something like grim resolve. "A way off this planet. And fast." The interior of the outpost was dimly lit and smelled of rust and old machinery. Sparse furnishings lined the walls, crates stacked haphazardly, and a flickering console hummed in the corner. Elyra leaned against one of the crates, her breathing still labored, but her eyes were alert, scanning the room. Kael watched the old man move with surprising agility for someone who appeared so worn by time. He rummaged through one of the crates, pulling out a small, worn datapad, muttering to himself. "You got a name?" Kael asked, wiping the sweat from his brow. The old man glanced up briefly. "Call me Corin." He returned to his task without elaborating. "If the Dominion's after you, I can't keep you here for long. They'll scour this place clean once they track that ship's last signal. We just need a way off-world," Elyra said, her voice stronger now, though tinged with exhaustion. "Do you have a ship?" Corin snorted. "I'm not running a luxury liner. The only thing I have is an old cargo freighter, barely spaceworthy." He hesitated, his eyes narrowing. "But if you're desperate enough, it might just do." Kael exchanged a glance with Elyra, her eyes reflecting the same determination he felt. "It'll have to," Kael said. Corin sighed, then gestured for them to follow. "Come on. It's in the hangar." They moved quickly through narrow corridors, the walls lined with old wires and corroded panels. Every step echoed ominously, and Kael's hand remained on the hilt of his knife, ready for anything. "How long have you been out here?" Kael asked, trying to break the tense silence. "Too long," Corin replied, his tone bitter. "Used to be a mechanic for the Outer Rim colonies. When the Dominion came, I ran. Like everyone else who didn't want to be enslaved or killed." They entered a large hangar, the ceiling high and domed. In the center sat a bulky, weathered freighter, its hull patchy with mismatched plating. It was old, battered, but intact. "There she is," Corin said, a mix of pride and resignation in his voice. The Star's Edge. She's ugly, but she'll fly. Kael approached the ship, running a hand along its dented hull. It'll do. Elyra looked at Corin, her expression softening. You've already risked much for us. Why help? Corin shrugged, leaning against a rusted console. Had a daughter once. The Dominion took her. His voice was rough, laced with pain. If I can save someone else's, maybe it'll mean something. A heavy silence fell, broken only by the distant hum of the freighter's systems warming up. Let's get her ready, Corin said, pushing off the console. We don't have much time. They worked quickly, loading supplies and checking systems. Kael monitored the sensors while Elyra calibrated the ship's navigation. Corin paced, grumbling to himself, but always keeping an ear out for approaching danger. As they worked, a sudden alarm blared through the outpost, the harsh sound reverberating through the hangar. Corin's face turned grim. They're here. Kael sprinted to the console, scanning the readout. 2 Dominion ships inbound. He turned to Corin. Can this thing get us out of here in time? Corin nodded, already moving toward the cockpit. She'll have to. Elyra grabbed Kael's arm, her eyes blazing. You saved me once. Now it's my turn. She pressed something cold and metallic into his hand, a small, glowing device. A defense node. It'll buy us a few seconds. Kael stared at her, then nodded, heart pounding. I'm not losing you now. They scrambled into the freighter, Corin taking the pilot's seat as the engines roared to life. The ship shuddered, dust and debris scattering as it lifted off the ground. Outside, the Dominion ships descended, sleek and deadly, their weapons charging. Kael activated the defense node, and a shimmering barrier surrounded the freighter, absorbing the first volley of plasma fire. Hang on, Corin shouted, pulling the freighter into a steep climb. The ship groaned under the strain, but it held. As they broke through the atmosphere, Kael caught one last glimpse of the barren world below, now just a memory of where their bond had begun. We made it, Elyra whispered, slumping against the bulkhead, exhaustion finally overtaking her. Kael sat beside her, the weight of everything they had endured settling over him. For now. But even as the stars stretched before them, endless and unknown, Kael knew one thing for certain. They were no longer running alone. The stars stretched endlessly beyond the cockpit's viewport, shimmering like fragments of distant dreams. The freighter had slipped into the serene quiet of hyperspace, its engines humming softly. In the stillness, the tension that had gripped Kael finally loosened, leaving behind only exhaustion and relief. Elyra sat across from him, her silver skin glowing faintly in the dim cabin light. Though she looked weary, her eyes sparkled with a quiet contentment. The dark circles under her eyes had faded, and the once labored rise and fall of her chest was steady. You did it, she said softly, her voice warm and laced with gratitude. You saved us. Kael leaned back, running a hand through his hair, still catching his breath. Couldn't have done it without Corin's ship, or that defense node of yours. Corin, seated in the pilot's chair, chuckled without turning around. Don't give me too much credit, kid. That ship's held together by hope and duct tape. You're lucky it didn't fall apart mid-lift. Elyra laughed, a sound like soft music, and for a moment, the weight of their harrowing escape felt lighter. Still, she said, her gaze lingering on Kael, you risked everything for me. Kael shrugged, trying to downplay it. You've got a knack for making it sound like more than it is. It is more, she insisted, her tone softening. You gave me your blood. You gave me your strength when I had none. That is not a small thing. For a moment, they sat in silence, the only sound the gentle hum of the ship. Kael felt the heat rise in his face, unsure how to respond to such raw honesty. I guess. I didn't want to lose you, he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. Elyra reached across the narrow space between them, her cool fingers brushing his hand. You won't. Corin cleared his throat loudly, clearly amused. You two better save the sappy stuff for later. We've got work to do. Kael laughed, the tension finally breaking. Fine, old man. What's next on the list? Corin leaned back in his chair, folding his arms. You wanted to find her people, right? He glanced at Elyra, his expression softening. "I know of a few Zhelari refugee ships moving between safe havens. We might be able to track them down." Elyra's eyes widened with hope. "You know where they are?" "Not exactly," Corin admitted. "But I've got contacts who might. And now that we've outrun the Dominion, we've got time to figure it out." Kael felt a warmth bloom in his chest, a rare sense of possibility. "We'll find them," he said, confidence returning to his voice. "Together." Elyra smiled, the tension in her posture easing. "Together." The freighter sailed on through the starry void, carrying them toward an uncertain future but away from the fear and despair that had once gripped them. They were no longer alone, no longer adrift. In the endless vastness of space, they had found something more powerful than survival. They had found each other.